You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Sean Wilkie, and we've got a really special episode for you this week. Ivan, please go ahead and introduce today's guest.
Hey, I'm Ivan Zach, and I'm very excited to introduce today's guest. This is someone that Sean brought in. I didn't know he knows people, but this is Jason Scott, and Jason comes to us from Google. Pretty interesting biography. He finished an undergrad degree at MIT, and then he got his professional start in management consulting at Arthur D. Little. After that, he moved from Boston to San Francisco to join the YC-backed startup HomeJoy, and subsequently went to pursue an MBA at Stanford. During that and after, he worked independently with a number of startups, eventually joining an investment team at Highland Capital Partners. Jason came to Google in early 2018 as a global startup programs manager on a Google Cloud. Today, he manages Google's North American-based accelerator programs and startup developer engagement strategy. In addition, he also remains an active seed investor, startup advisor, and founder of Faction SF, a community for creatives, entrepreneurs, and early-stage investors. Jason, what a pleasure. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you came in by invitation from Shawn, and you met him through the program, and that was specific to the voice startups. That was probably a terrible way to put it together, but can you tell us a little more? What is that program, and how did you meet Shawn there?
Yes, I was very excited to work with Shawn and the Talk.to team in our voice accelerator. It's our first one we've ever done, but the goal there really was take what Google does well and always bring it to startups and founders who are really the ones who create the innovation, right? So I think in this program, we had 10 weeks where we had Googlers dive in deep with founders and help them build their tech. And the Talk.to team is doing some great work leveraging voice in the medical and veterinary space. And it was really awesome to see the Googlers sit down with them and really advance them with respect to particularly the stuff they're doing with data, machine learning, and voice user interfaces.
That's awesome. So I just want to open up a little bit. So the audience that we have here, there's a lot of people that are looking into building startups, and we rarely talk here. We usually talk about the actual products and how they develop them. It's interesting entrepreneurial stories. I think it would be very interesting to kind of walk people through. If I have an idea and I'm starting a startup, what does Google and such services play a role? Because what shifted tremendously in the last sort of 15 years is before, if you come up with the idea, there's so much infrastructure that you have to establish yourself before you even get there and start building the product. As I understand it, and I'm very limited in my understanding being a veterinarian, that Google is not necessarily producing the end products. Now it's just a massive platform that has all this cool sort of technology that you can layer your software on top of infrastructure that already exists. And Google is very proactively helping these startups to utilize that platform. Am I getting it right?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, Google, I think, and I said this a little bit, but Google's best position really to help kind of accelerate, pun intended, accelerate these founders, regardless of how early they are, right? Like as soon as you're starting a company, whether it be just starting with a domain, right, or throwing some ad campaigns out there, all the way to actually having data and where do you store your data and what can you learn from your data using machine learning, and all the way to then growing and actually acquiring customers, right? I think we're really well positioned to kind of support along that life cycle. So my whole mission and goal is to really just help guide founders, because I think the biggest challenge, honestly, is that Google is a massive beast, and for so many founders, where do you even start and how do you navigate it, right? So that's kind of my job. I'm kind of the shepherd, one might say, that helping founders navigate this massive web of resources and potential ways to get help. But I think regardless of where you are, I think there's something for you. So I always say, in short, if you don't know where to start, startup.google.com is kind of the place to start. And then also you can just stalk me on LinkedIn and send me a message. I'm always happy to help.
Yeah, that's awesome, Jason. And it's so awesome to have you here, after the program wrapped up. It's been a long time. We haven't got to see each other every day for, 10 weeks. So the week after it wrapped up, it's nice to have you on our show. It helps with the separation anxiety. But I wanted to double click on Ivan's question. And so Ivan's really talking more about, Google's this big platform that you can build anything on. And, double clicking on that question, and then also kind of how does Google think about innovation? What does Google do to help foster that innovation that you guys are famous for?
Yeah, I mean, and I think what Google's realized is that we're at a size now where we really have to take a bottoms up approach sometimes with respect to innovation, right? So whether it be internally, we have internal incubators where people can make 20 to 100% of their job really focused on an idea and really fleshing that out and really taking the time and space to do that. But also programs like the Accelerator, where we're Googlers. I have 200 plus Googlers in North America that volunteer a day a week just to work with founders, right? And that's a Google sanctioned, Google promoted more so than sanctioned activity. And so where Google really realizes that the innovation is going to start with these entrepreneurs who can be nimble, can be fast, and have this passion, and then we can really just support them along their journey, and then eventually maybe partner with them. Maybe they become part of Google at some point in their journey, but I think where we're best positioned to be is at the best supporting actor role, right, or actress role, where we really can come in hand with those founders and support them and roll up our sleeves. And so, yes, through my Googler, I always say Googlers love startups and startups love Googlers, because Google has really made it really feasible for founders to have, as you had, a couple of Googlers that just work with them hand in hand, day in and day out, to really work on their projects. So I think Google really values entrepreneurship as kind of the long tail, and where we as a company, where do we need to invest today so that we can have the partners and the customers and the employees of tomorrow, and really nurture them today, right?
So, and I want to kind of take one step back, because a lot of the founders of the companies in the veterinary domain, they're veterinarians, and they have a good idea how to solve a certain problem. But when I started my previous company that subsequently sort of serviced multiple veterinarians, around 650 before we exited, and I had no idea where to start. I'm a vet, right? There's no any understanding of technology. So I just want to kind of describe, that when you have an idea, in the past, you would need to build like servers, and then how they spin, your environment, that then it would be on your phone, but it will be connecting to that server. These days, Google has basically a platform as a service with the infrastructure as a service on top of it. And all you need to do is to build that final solution that plugs into multiple services. And that's called GCP. So that's a Google Cloud platform, right? And that's how you kind of approach it. And then you can learn about it. And then, usually you would have a technical co-founder that should have the knowledge of how to build the tech. And if you have the solution as subject matter expert, that's how I would approach any startup, I guess, in the veterinary domain. Is that sort of the right way to pitch Google platform to everybody who has no idea?
100%. I think what does Google do best? We host data and we help people navigate that data. And right, and there's no reason why as a founder you should be worried about, as you said, servers on premise, and how you're going to house your data, how you're going to scale the data, how do you afford the capital expenses of all of that infrastructure, right? So this is where Google is able to really essentially loan founders these resources to run these experiments, run these user tests, and really kind of find that product market fit. And then eventually we scale with you, right? So in the beginning, it's all about how do we invest today in the founders, because some of them, not all of them, are really onto something, right? And will really, given the right support and right resources, be able to scale that and eventually one day be your own unicorn, right? And then obviously be a partner or a customer of Google at some point. But I think today, if you're a founder, you should not be worried about how do I afford a server, or where do I find a server to house my data, right? What we have are out of the box solutions so that you can really focus on the problem and really focus on, am I really solving a problem for my user? In your case, I'm a veterinarian. I know veterinarians have this problem. Can I focus on how I'm going to solve that problem versus focusing on all the, I guess I wouldn't call them distractions, but all the other things that obstacles that kind of get in the way of starting a company.
That's awesome, Jason. Yeah, it makes tons of sense. So you're a startup guy. You've been in the world for a really long time, and you've got this really cool gig at Google. Our experience as part of the startup ecosystem and the accelerator was just incredible. How do you go about putting the right programming together to foster innovation over a short 10-week period? how did that all come together? Because there's got to be some commonality across the different areas that you guys provide this kind of acceleration.
Yeah, and so for me, I really focus on what I call the pillars that I think are foundational to any startup. One is obviously product and design and UX, and really understanding the product side of things, and as you're building product and product roadmap, making sure that you have the support doing that. If you're not a product manager or have experience in that. The second is what we were just talking about, the infrastructure, particularly if you're using data or data is a main component of your product. How can we support you in understanding not just data integrity and how to best manage that data, but also best principles around security and the things that you shouldn't have to be. You shouldn't have to be a full-time lawyer, infrastructure expert, as well as software engineer just to start your company, right? So how can we support you there? And then shifting gears, I think something else Google does well and where we started, right, is around acquiring users and customers. And I think no business is going to be successful if they can't acquire customers, right? So how can we really support you there? And then really kind of rounding it out, what I call quantified leadership. Google kind of gets a little bit of there are lots of jokes around Google and our approach to how we manage people and with using data around people and OKRs, what we call objectives and key results and measurement. I'm a big advocate of what I call quantified leadership. So I love at least sharing that with my founders of how we think about people management as well at Google, because I think it's something that I admire about the organization. So for me, that's kind of the foundational. Every founder, regardless of the sector you're in, you can be in what we call life sciences, you can be in climate, you can be in B2B SaaS, but regardless of the sector, you kind of have these foundational pillars. And that's where I really think we come in to really help make sure you have that foundation until you have a full-time product manager, a full-time head of growth, a full-time head of people, etc.
That's awesome. So if I have an idea and I heard this podcast and I'm like, damn, I wanted to solve this problem all the time. I don't have all this knowledge. It sounds like Google will help me. Where do you look for help? Don't tell me Google it, please. Just where do you go to find, how do you become a part of this awesomeness, and how do you tap into these resources? Are there programs that help startups? Is there a filtering process to say your idea is good, your idea is work on it a little longer? How does one go about to tap into this?
Yeah, so I will give you two answers. But one thing I say to every founder is, if you're going to be a founder and you have that conviction around your idea and have already committed to it, you have to be a little bit shameless, right? So I was joking and saying you could reach out to me directly, but honestly, you should. And honestly, you should reach out
That's awesome.
because, as I mentioned before, Googlers love startups and startups love Googlers, and Googlers oftentimes are excited to be able to take a break from their day to day to support a founder, right? And support something really of personal interest. So that's the off the record. I guess it's on the record, but the off the record tip. But I will say we try our best to aggregate these resources as well. So I mentioned it earlier, but startup.google.com is kind of an aggregation of a lot of different programs around the company that support founders. So whether you're looking for help around Android and Play, or voice and assistant, or cloud and AI ML, or growth and sales, a lot of our programs are housed there, and they can kind of route you to the right place. But I think when all else fails, reach out and ask, because I think one thing that's unique about the culture at Google that keeps me here, honestly, is that people truly are fascinated and excited by entrepreneurship and are willing to help and excited to help.
Jason, how do you guys, so for the voice AI one that just finished, or the climate change finish, you guys have a ton of applications. What does the process to select, the 10 people out of however many, what does that look like? How do you guys do that?
And how did you end up with Shawn on that list?
Hey, you be quiet.
Well, I was gonna take it into a compliment, but I see you took it a different direction. But I will say, Shawn, compliments to you. But yes, we have upwards of thousands of applicants a year for our programs, and part of why, like I said, I have these other programs that are a little bit more scaled and accessible is because we do not want to be exclusive by any means. We really want to support everyone. But for the accelerator programs, truly, it literally does take a village. We have Googlers involved all the way up to the most senior folks within the company. It becomes a very democratic process, honestly. So we all sit and I host these meetings in which we go through these companies, the shortlisted companies, and really decide where is Google best positioned to help them be successful, right? So of course it could be a great company, but if we're not able to help them be successful, then it would be a waste of everyone's time, right, to bring them into this program. But for some of these companies, Google can truly make a difference in their success. And as many of you may or may not know, 94% plus of startups at the earliest of stages aren't successful. And with our goal is to really change that percentage, right, and really help, with Google's help, mitigate some of that risk of failure for some of our founders. So the question we ask is, how can Google help, and where can Google have the most impact? Because ultimately, out of thousands of applicants, of course, we have hundreds of great founders and great companies, but we really want to focus on how can we make a big difference for a select few.
So maybe a kind of a weird question. So when you think about it, when you're in that committee, are you trying to find those 5% or 6% that will succeed, or you're trying to increase the number from 6% up?
Yeah, it's a little of both, and I would say I would be lying if it were perfect science, honestly. But I think ultimately our goal is, one, by the time they get to a short list, all of these are great companies, and I always start those conversations with that statement because, again, if you're in the top 10 percentile, then you're building something great that's of interest, right? So at that point, it really is, again, what we do best. Google's mission is around organizing the world's information and making it readily available and accessible to everyone. All of our companies that go into our product are leveraging data in an interesting way, in a way that we think Google can also support them, whether they're already doing AI machine learning today or just doing really interesting things with data more broadly. Google does data well. It is our bread and butter. So how can we really come in and support them with the best practices around machine learning and artificial intelligence, or security and data integrity and data storage and infrastructure and all those things. So that is really what we're looking for. But again, I think with the right support, we can really change that number. So for me, philosophically, my personal life mission is around accessibility and making it easier to be a founder, and again, mitigating some of that risk of failure through support.
So Jason, there's some real innovation that's had to happen in your world because of COVID. And if there's anybody that I know that's been on a lot of video calls, it's you. There was some really interesting things that got triggered for me as in my participation with Google around video calls. And I'm just wondering if you can share some of that insight or some of those kind of learnings that you've had to be able to help connect and bring people together through a laptop and a webcam. Because I know that's not your preferred way.
Well, so I was going to say, to be fair, I have been a remote work advocate for many, many years. I used to work with a startup. Back when I was at Highland Capital Partners, I was supporting our future of work practice and worked with a couple startups in the space. So I am a huge remote work advocate and can nerd out about that any day. But what I will say is, I think we're at an inflection point where the pandemic has really been forcing people to get over some of the, I guess, what I call learning hurdles with respect to remote work and engaging remotely. But I think teams are increasingly global. So many of my founders have a head of engineering in APAC, have a head of product down in Latin America, et cetera, right? So it really is the time. And I think like pandemic has really been a forcing function there to really support us in doing that. But to answer your question in terms of best practices, one thing I will say is you just have to be intentional, right? And honestly think about, what are we missing from the way we used to engage, and how do we intentionally add that, right? So how do you intentionally add time for people to have conversation? Can you have your first 5 minutes of all meetings have some sort of way to connect on a personal level before you dive right into the transactional business? How do you intentionally plan for people? One thing that I do, for instance, for anyone onboarding, they always now have an onboarding person starting with them, someone onboarding with them at the start, because you used to serendipitously run into folks on your first day and kind of build those bonds. Now, because meetings become so transactional, you kind of have to force it, right? So as a leader, for me, it's, where do I intentionally insert these things that some people may laugh at? Oh, icebreaker, oh, we're doing this. But at the end of the day, it works, right? And we're humans, and humans are built upon connection, right? And we need those connections. So how do you intentionally force those? But now the benefits to me completely outweigh the additional effort. Right now, you can have continuous production cycles where you have teammates around the world continuously producing. Now you can automatically have more inclusive products because you have more diversity of opinions in your product design and in your road mapping and your user testing. So I think there are a lot of inherent benefits that will way outweigh the additional investment required to kind of compensate, I would say. Again, I'm biased, heavily biased in this, but that is my opinion.
So what I wanted to say, Jason, I just wanted to highlight a couple of like the high points for me. We had a sales kind of leadership engagement session. So Amanda did such an incredible job. There was probably 40 to 50 people on this Google Meet or Zoom or whatever, a video call. And she asked everybody on the meet within the first 5 minutes a question. And literally, you had these people that were kind of like, you could tell they were typing. But then all of a sudden they weren't because they were scared that they were going to get another question. And then the other thing that she did when she was facilitating her session, she did these breakout rooms in 2 to 3 people. And then you had these authentic one-on-one conversations that you were having with people. And that, I mean, in this remote world, that was one of the coolest things that I had seen done over video. And I just thought, for anybody that's listening to our show, if you're using Zoom, if you're using Google Meet to do sessions with your people, your staff, breakout rooms are magical. They really allow people to connect one-on-one as opposed to just be a person observing, which feels like you're watching a YouTube video at that point, if you're just taking it in, as opposed to where you're actually having a 2-way or 3-way conversation. So any other kind of tidbits like that you've seen in this kind of video world that we're now all living in?
Yeah, and I think on the other side of that, what I will say is also just being very. You have to also be compassionate for people in their different situations and make sure you're also being inclusive, right? So what I will say is we also started the program, which you might remember, Shawn, with telling everyone you also have to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. If they are off of camera for some reason, don't assume it's because they're not paying attention. Understand that we all have many things. We're all part-time teachers at home right now, or part-time daycare, or part-time running companies, part-time home service providers. We're all wearing many hats. So I think the trust is another foundational thing, and making sure that you are letting people know that it is okay if they do need to disengage, but when they are present, they're present, and will communicate and over communicate when it is critically important. So as you mentioned for the sales session, we let people know many, many times ahead of that this is highly participatory. You won't get anything out of it if you're not participating, and so let us know ahead of time. And so I think, again, it all comes back to just being incredibly intentional and incredibly over communicating. And as a leader, I will say that means a lot more responsibility on you. You can't just show up to a meeting, but by being intentional and over communicating with your team, you're able to, again, I think, really make it incredibly meaningful and incredibly impactful as an org. So I think, breakout groups, as you mentioned, there's so many functions coming out, the hand raising functions and the polls and so many ways to make it fun and engaging. But I think ultimately, as long as you're being thoughtful, I just remember so many days in the past where we all just show up to the conference room and there was no kind of plan or thought around how to keep people engaged. So I think that is the biggest takeaway for me.
That's really cool. And, that brings back a lot. I've been running companies remotely for the last 8 years, and there's always strict rules, always on camera, always participating. And then it's, you can see when people typing emails, you just know, you can't hide it. So it just looks stupid. So I always try to, at the end of our leadership meetings, I call out on people and say, now you tell one thing that this person should change, and it can be nothing. You have to say something. So then everybody knows that there will be a question at the end. So it's interesting how to kind of, scare people, I guess, that they will be asked. But those are all great tips. We're running out of time, I think we always do here. But I really want to ask one question that everybody will probably ask. And it was on sort of those lists of things, because everybody thinks, okay, I'm starting this. I'm going to, I have a certain amount of cash to start it. And then at what point and how do I look for capital? So is there something new about the access to capital? What changed in 2020? Like, do you have any opinion on that or what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, and I will say it's changing. Venture capital is changing, and just access to capital is changing, I think, for the better. I think it's forcing people to not just rely on proximity to invest and really kind of think about how do they get out of their bubbles. But I think secondarily, one thing that's a pro for entrepreneurs is I think there is so much capital out there right now, and people are looking for good investments. So what I will say is, first question to ask is, do you need to be raising venture capital? I think there's so many other non-dilutive types of capital that you can explore and you should explore, and at least make it again an intentional decision. And then secondarily, I think ultimately there are so many people who are now becoming angels or early stage investing that you can really reach out to and understand. Are there folks who really understand my space? So to your point, Are there people within the veterinary industry, for instance, that might also angel invest on the side that really understand what I'm trying to do and really understand the problem and not just give me capital, but also roll up their sleeves to really help me be successful? I think that's what you should look for at the earliest of stages. But one thing I will say about venture capital is I hope that the trend that has continued over the last year of investors kind of leaving their bubbles, their usual bubbles, will be maintained as we shift to digital and as I can engage with an investor, whether I'm in Palo Alto in the Bay Area or Toronto or in Halifax, right? And so I think that is a pro and something I'm excited about.
Awesome, Jason. Well, listen, this has been super fun. We'll have to schedule another episode so we stay in touch, maybe in a month or two. But we always like to end in the exact same way. So first question is a book, a TED Talk, something that's inspired you along your journey to get where you're at.
Yes. So if I'm going to cheat, I'm going to name two. So two books. One that if you did see me on LinkedIn, it's even in my LinkedIn header, but it's called Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi. And it's all around the power of networks and the power of kind of paying it forward to in the ecosystem. And another one kind of on the topic of product inclusion, it's called Build for Everyone by Annie Jean-Baptiste, and that's one that is a little bit newer, but and she's a good friend of mine out of Google, but all about how do you think about inclusivity from beginning to end, and incorporating that into your teams and your products, and eventually into your addressable market and users.
That's awesome. And the last question, is there anyone that you think we could invite to this podcast?
Yeah, so I was joking earlier that there's so many companies that are in spaces around animals and pet health that I think you would find interesting. One is Companion. So joincompanion.com is the startup, and they're using AI machine learning for training and really helping increase adoption rates and reduce anxiety around pets in the home. Another one, I'm also into food personally. And so a couple of companies, one Wild Earth, which is alternative proteins in the space. And another one's called Cabo, which is around customization of food for our animals in our home. So those are all interesting ones that I engage with, and I think are using data again in an interesting way to support the animals that we love.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. We want to invite you to join the Digital Veterinary Summit, which will take place virtually on 27th, 28th of July. The event brings together over 150 executives from the veterinary industry to examine the sector's digital trends and dynamics and showcase the industry's most exciting emerging technologies.
If you are a digital veterinary innovator, you can apply for the Digital Technology Showcase and get a chance to introduce your product to the audience. My friend Ivan is on the selection committee. Please go check it out at thedigitalveterinarysummit.com.
If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinaryinnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.